In The Origin of Species, Charles Darwin wrote, "It is not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent that survives. It is the one that is most adaptable to change." Well, Mr. Fidler is a man who knew he needed to adapt in order to keep moving himself and his family forward. From his early days in the Great Depression, when he figured out how to make ends meet, to answering the call of duty in World War II in Korea, Mr. Fidler has never been afraid to face change head-on. When he returned home from the Korean conflict, he had to adapt to the changes in the textile industry and to being a family man. Change can be difficult, but it brings about many new possibilities for the future. Welcome to the 19th episode of the Ping Jockey Podcast. Mr. Fidler, tell me what it was like to return to your bride, Betty, after the service.
Well, Betty and Mary Beth were still living in Chester with Betty's parents, along with our dog, Butch. It was great to be home again, and it was time for many changes and decisions to be made. I asked myself things like, where were we going to live, and did I still have a job? We spent the month of December getting used to each other and again just enjoying being together. My mother was still living on Pear Street in Reading, and we went home to visit her soon after I got home. I was relieved to find out that I still had a job with Textile Machine Works and that I could start working on January 7th, 1952. I believe we managed to move back to Reading by the time soon after. We still had the old 1946 Chevrolet, and it was a time of change for everyone. I was adjusting to being home after 18 months in the military, and Betty was adjusting to having a baby and finally having her husband home. Betty and I set up housekeeping in our own first home and loved spending time with Mary Beth, who was 6 months old. It was great to be with Butch and my mother, who lived with us for a while.
Wow, I'm sure it felt really good to be home with the ones you loved. My boyfriend was only gone 3 weeks, and it felt like an eternity, and you were gone for a lot longer than that, so wow. Now, Mr. Fidler, before you were summoned back to serve in the Korean conflict, you were erecting knitting machines in Burlington, North Carolina. Did you return to that position, or did you do something else?
Well, when I went back to work at Textile, things had changed a lot. When I went back into the Navy in 1950, things were booming in the knitting machine business, but by now, the circular seamless knitting machine came into the market. It made one stocking at a time, like a tube, and had no seam. The full-fashion knitting machines made 30 stockings at a time. They were knitted flat and then seamed up the back and were made to the shape of the leg and fancy designs in them, which made them look a lot more attractive. The problem was that the seamless were cheaper to make, and also the women started to wear more slacks, shorts, and dungarees. So all of a sudden the market for full-fashion stockings fell off tremendously. Needless to say, there were not very many erector jobs to be had out on the road. Fortunately, they were still putting up machines over at the Berkshire Knitting Mills, right next door to the Textile Machine Works. The One Missing Industries, who owned Textile Machine Works, owned the Berkshire Knitting Mills. They made the full-fashion knitting machines and braiding machines, which made nylon cord for things like parachute cord. The Berkshire knitting mills used the full-fashion knitting machines made by Textile, and they were one of the largest knitting machines in the world. Wyoming Industries also owned Nara Fabric, and they used the braiding machines to make the nylon cord and a lot of other fabrics. I always enjoyed working at Berkshire knitting mills machines. It was always interesting and challenging work, and the fellows that I worked with were always very nice. The last 2 years of my trade, I spent most of the time building knitting machines at Berkshire. Most of us were apprentices being trained by the two fellows who were in charge of installing the knitting machines. They were great fellows to work for, and whenever an outside erector was between jobs on the road, they brought them in to work with us. It was a good experience because we learned a lot from them. Having just returned from the Navy, I was happy to get a chance to work at Berkshire again. Only this time, none of us were apprentices. All of us were old, experienced erectors who used to work out on the road and worked in the mill until we were called out. I really considered myself lucky to even be asked to work there, considering that there weren't many jobs available in the industry. Some of the erectors didn't get that chance. They were sent to work back in the machine shop, which was less desirable and less money. I had the opportunity to meet many of the old and experienced erectors and heard a lot of good stories about their experiences. I actually used to look forward to going to work and believe I enjoyed erecting more than any other job I ever had. Soon after I was working again, I bought a tan 1915 Chevrolet. It was like new and very nice looking. It was two-door with a sloped torpedo-shaped back, and it had a spotlight outside the driver's side window, and you could control from a handle inside.
Oh, that was nice.
Yeah. I remember many a weekend we loaded up the car and went back to Chester to visit Grammy and Pop-Pop McBride. We had a nice car bed for Mary Beth that fit in the back seat, and most of the trips she slept, most all on the way down and back. That is one trait that I don't believe that she had lost.
Well, from my experience with Mary Beth, I know that she can fall asleep on a dime and not be woken by anything. And to be honest, I envy it.
Yes, a lot of times when she brings the dogs over and we're sitting there, and after a while I said, "Bunch, I'll wake you up."
So tell me more about what it was like to be back in the industry.
Well, around 1953, work started to get bad, and most of us were sent back to Textile Machine Works to work in the shop. That meant a considerable drop in pay, and it wasn't long before I realized that I wasn't going to be able to afford to keep my nice, almost new Chevrolet. It broke my heart, but I advertised it in the paper and quickly found a buyer. Believe it or not, for the next 2 years, we did without a car.
Wow.
That's really something.
Ooh, Shoe Leather Express all across town.
I worked second shift most of that time, which meant I could take a bus or trolley car to work. However, most of the time I had to walk home because it was too late for public transportation. Working back in the shop was a big change from building knitting machines. I was in the milling department, and most of it was piecework, but the rates were too high to make any money. The parts we machined were made of cast iron, and that made it a pretty dirty job. After a few months, I ended up with a bad skin condition. They sent me to the doctor and said it was a breakdown of the fatty tissues from washing my hands so much, and that before I washed my hands, I should take most of the dirt off with mineral oil and then wash them. I followed the doctor's orders, and my hands slowly improved.
Oh, wow, that must have been...
Yeah, that wasn't any fun.
No.
That was a dirty place.
Oh, good Lord.
It was sort of a drag walking home late at night, especially in bad weather. One hot summer night, I was walking home at 1 a.m., and a policeman stopped me. He asked me a lot of questions, like who was I, and where was I going, and where I lived.
Why was he asking these questions?
Well, I found out the next morning that a girl was murdered, and they found her body in a trash can about a block away on the next street over.
Oh.
As far as I know, that murder was never solved.
Wow. So they thought you could have been a suspect.
Yeah, well, I was asking everybody, and I lived right near there.
Oh.
And who's going to be out 1 o'clock in the morning?
Was Betty afraid when she heard about the murder?
I think so, yeah.
Oh, man. Especially being at home with a baby.
Yeah.
Wow, so was your neighborhood? What kind of neighborhood were you living in?
It was a nice neighborhood. Most of the people were very nice. They had very different jobs.
A lot of children?
And a lot of children, yeah. And 2 doors down from us was a family, Red and Miriam Moyer, and they had a son, Kenny. And Red worked at the American Casualty Insurance Company, where Betty worked before I met her. He was a veteran of World War II, and he was in the Rangers. He was hurt pretty bad in Italy during the Battle of Anzio.
What does it mean to be a ranger?
He was in the elite military formation of the United States Army.
Oh, wow. That's interesting. So Red got hurt pretty badly in the Battle of Anzio. What happened?
Eventually, he had his leg amputated.
Oh, wow.
That didn't slow him down, though, and he was very active with the Boy Scouts. I'd like to tell the story about a time he was with the Scouts at summer camp. After lights out, when everyone was supposed to be in their tents sleeping, he heard that there was going to be a walkthrough inspection by some of the bigwigs. So he took his artificial leg off and placed under the edge of the tent so that half of it stuck outside. Well, the inspector walked through, and when he saw the leg protruding from the tent, he gave it a good kick. To his surprise, the leg went quite a distance. Red never said what happened after that, but he got a kick telling the story.
Kick telling the story, pun intended. So what else was it like to be back at home on Pear Street with Mary Beth and Betty? Any funny stories at the house?
Yeah, we had a lot of bats in the neighborhood, and every once in a while, one got in the house. I don't know if they flew in the door when we walked in sometimes, or if they got in someplace up in the attic. But every once in a while, we would find one flying around in the house. So I got my bat catcher outfit, a hat and a broom, opened the door or a window, and tried to chase it out.
What was the hat for?
Because they'd get in their hair.
Oh.
That wasn't
fun. No thanks.
It never seemed to work too well. I remember one time I was chasing one in the living room, and when I knocked it down and went onto the sofa, and it laid there baring its teeth at me. One time, the lady who lived 3 doors down woke up in the middle of the night with a bat lying on her chest.
Oh,
can you imagine how that felt?
Ugh, awful.
One night when we were putting Mary Beth to bed, she stood up in her crib and said, "Look at the butterfly." Just then a bat flew by and I was off for my bat catching outfit again.
Oh. You had a full outfit. How funny. Oh, man. Well, it's never a dull moment with you. So in past episodes, we've talked a good bit about your brother Ray and your mom and dad and Betty's parents as well, but did Betty have a sibling?
Yeah. Betty had a brother by the name of Francis William McBride. He was born about 1926 and had health problems from the time he was very young. I believe he had rheumatic fever or a rheumatic heart, or both. As he was growing up, he was always known as Buddy. Because of his health, Betty's mother used to take her and her brother up to the Poconos, where they stayed on a farm outside of Tannersville for the summer.
Oh, wow.
Buddy had wanderlust. At times he disappeared without even a goodbye. During World War II, he tried to join the Navy, but he was turned down because of his health. Sometimes later, he took off without a word, and no one knew where he went. Soon after that, his draft notice came up. But since he wasn't around to sign up, even though they probably wouldn't have taken him, he automatically became a draft dodger. As times went by, every now and then an FBI agent stopped by the home of Betty's parents just to see if they had ever heard from him. By the time I met Betty in 1948, her brother had been gone about 3 years, and they still didn't know where he was. That all changed in the early summer of 1953, when Betty's parents received a birth announcement from Buddy. It was mailed from the state of Washington, and it read, "Name, Frank William McBride. Birthday, May 22nd, 1953. Weight, 7 pounds, 8 3/4 ounces. Parents, Sylvia and Frank." A note at the bottom of the announcement read, "I'm in good health. You'll be hearing from me again." Later that summer, we received a phone call from Betty's parents, and her mother and Buddy showed up at their doorstep alone. He said his wife and baby were home in New York. Mom asked if they could come up to visit us, and naturally we said yes. They soon arrived, and I met Buddy for the first time. He seemed all right, and we got along fine.
So you would see Bud again in a little bit, but he wasn't the only one with some good news about a baby.
During the year of 1953 and 54, Betty had 2 miscarriages and then finally became pregnant with Steve somewhere around the beginning in August.
Well, I'm sure that was very exciting for you and Betty, and things seem pretty stable, but as we know with you, something's always bound to change. So in next week's episode, we'll look into what happened next. Did Mr. Fidler stay in Reading, or was he once again called up to go somewhere else? Thanks for listening to this episode of the Ping Jockey Podcast. I'm Marley, the co-host, sitting here with the Ping Jockey himself, Mr. Kenneth H. Fidler.
Bye-bye.